What's up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a super important topic for anyone learning how to solo, improvise, or write melodies over chord changes. How to choose the right scales over certain chord progressions. We're going to be breaking it down into three different concepts: key center, chord scales, and substitutions. Now stick around till the end because I'll show you a real-world example where all three approaches can be applied. First up, let's talk about the key center approach. This is where you zoom out and ask, what key is this entire progression in? To keep things simple, I will be looking at the triads and seventh chords within the C major scale. Here we have C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and D diminished for the triads. Now, when looking at the seventh chords, we're only adding an extra note per chord, in which we'll have C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G 7, A minor 7, and B minor 7 flat 5. Now let's take a quick look at this chord progression of D minor 7, G 7, and C major 7. All of these chords are within the C major scale, and they are functioning as the 2 minor 7, 5 7, and 1 major 7 chords. This is the famous 2-5-1 chord progression everyone in jazz talks about. And there is a couple of more cliche chord progressions you should know about. I will be talking about these in the next week, so stay tuned. Now, instead of switching scales, you can just stay in the C major scale this whole time. This approach makes it way easier to solo, especially if you're just getting started. And honestly, a ton of famous solos use this approach. The main trick here is to look at the different chords in a chord progression and to find out how they are functioning within a scale. Now, if you look at the different chords, you have D minor 7, G 7, and C major 7. Like I mentioned, this is the 2-5-1. You call it the 2-5-1 because you assign a number to each of the chords within the scale, and that is the particular function of that chord. C major is the 1, D minor is the 2, E minor the 3, etc., etc. Once you find the key, you are good to go. All you have to do is just play that same scale up and down all over that chord progression, and all of the notes will work. Now, when should you use this approach? When the whole progression stays in one key. If you want smooth connected lines, which you could do with a couple of the other different ways as well. It depends on how you construct those lines. And when you're in your jam session or improvising quickly, this is a really good spot where you might want to consider doing this because it keeps things a lot simpler. But the more you practice, the more you might want to grab a little bit from the next concept we're going to be talking about, which is chord scales. This is the idea that every chord in a progression has its own scale, usually based on its function or its extensions, and this leaves a lot of room to play with. This is a particularly cool approach if you're working with genres that maintain each chord for a longer length of time, which means you can play around with different types of scales. And to be honest, this is one of my favorite approaches. Even when I'm playing in a key center approach, I might spice it in a tiny little bit with some chord scales. Now let's go back to the 2-5-1 chord progression in C. So D minor 7, G 7, and C major 7. You could treat each chord as its own little world. So we have the D minor 7, and this time, instead of looking at it as the 2 minor 7, we're going to be looking at the formula of the chord. The chord has an intervallic construction of 1, flat 3, 5, and flat 7. How do you know which scale you can play over this? Just look at the formula of whatever scale you're looking into. So if you have a scale like Dorian, which has 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, you notice that you have 1, flat 3, 5, and flat 7 built in. This means that you can play that scale over the top of that chord. Now, it's not always as simple as this, and it's always good to maintain some sort of relationship to the key center, particularly depending on the type of style, genre, and chord progression that you're playing over. Let's go to the G7 chord, which can take quite a bit of information, and you grab any scale with a 1, 3, 5, flat 7 intervallic construction, and you can apply it. So you have things here like altered, but then you could also use things like dominant diminished. You could take a more classic approach like Mixolydian. Once you start thinking of things more in a chord scale type of approach, it leaves a lot of room to tinker and play with different sounds and different scales. Now let's take a quick look at this lick right here, which uses exactly the chord scale approach. Here's the only catch to this approach. It takes more mental effort to switch scales every chord. So it's definitely a lot harder, but you do get a lot of awesomeness happening between those different tones. You get a lot of different colors in there. Now, I actually use this approach quite a bit on most of the licks in my book, 100 Modern Fusion Guitar Licks. And that's actually where I got the lick that I just showed you guys, where it's applying these different chord scales. Another thing I really used a lot on this book is the next topic, substitution. All right, so let's get a little bit more advanced with substitutions. This is where you start thinking about alternate ways to interpret the harmony, and that changes the scale choices. Let me show you what I mean. So you might have a G7 chord, like the 5 chord we've been talking about for the whole video. Now, instead of thinking about it as G7, you could think about it as B minor 7 flat 5. And all it's going to do, you're going to get a lot of the same tones and a lot of the same character of the G7 chord. And that's just one simple way to think about this. You can do the same thing with different pentatonic scales. You can do the same thing with different arpeggios, different types of chords. Now, I'm not really going in too deep into these different concepts because I'm actually going to be creating a particular video for each of these different concepts, so stay tuned in the next up and coming weeks. The cool thing about substitutions is you can borrow chords or arpeggios from a bunch of different scales and kind of tie them together so you can apply some sort of information that you already know. Let's take the pentatonic scale. If you play the pentatonic scale from the flat third of the G7 chord, it'll give you a more of an altered kind of sound. But you don't really have to know the altered scale. You're just playing the pentatonic scale that we all know and love. Another common type of substitution here is a tritone substitution. So in this case, since we already have the G7 as our actual chord in the chord progression, you go up to the tritone of the G, which is D flat, and you're gonna play an arpeggio or chord from there. So you're gonna be playing D flat 7 over that G7. All these substitutions can give you a more outside or jazzy or fusiony type of sound depending on how you do it. You're basically reinterpreting the chord to open up different melodic possibilities. Here's another example from my book, 100 Modern Fusion Guitar Licks. Alright, so let's put this whole thing into practice. I'm going to be playing over this chord progression, same chord progression we've been talking about, D minor 7, G7, C major 7. Alright, that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed the sounds of the licks that I was using in today's video, remember you can find them over in this book. Now, if you want to learn more about some of the different cliche chord progressions that are out there in fusion and prog and those types of different styles, just click here on this video. If you want to find out more about the different chord scales that you can play, just click here. Alright, thanks for watching. Take care. Keep practicing.